Good afternoon, everyone, and for our folks that are listening in from abroad, good evening, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's virtual lunchbox, a expert panel discussion on entrepreneurship in the clinical world. Our webinar today is hosted jointly by the Queensland AI Hub and IntelliHQ Medical Innovation Centers here in Queensland, Australia, as well as the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, or SOAP, a global nonprofit innovation network based out of the United States. So we are coming to you live today from Gold Coast, Australia. As was mentioned, this webinar will be recorded, and audience members are encouraged to participate and to submit questions. There will be a segment at the end for our panelists to answer questions. So thanks once again for joining our discussion today. My name is Dr. Mark Lahovey. I'm the chapter leader of Brisbane SOAP, the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. As we all know, healthcare is undergoing substantial and rapid transformation due to the emergence of new technologies and new delivery models. I'm joined today by three expert panelists, experts in medical entrepreneurship, who will be discussing how innovation within healthcare is both challenging and unique, but also presents a tremendous amount of opportunity. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist. From the United States, we have Dr. Arlen Myers. Dr. Myers is an emeritus professor of otolaryngology, dentistry, and engineering at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He's also the president and CEO of Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, as well as an advisor at Medical Intelligence 10, mi10.ai. In addition to founding several medical device companies, he has written numerous articles and recently a textbook titled Digital Health Entrepreneurship, which provides a roadmap and hands-on approach to digital health and entrepreneurship. Our second panelist from the United States is Dr. Anthony Chang. Dr. Chang is the Chief Intelligence and Innovation Officer, as well as the Medical Director of the Heart Failure Program at Children's Hospital of Orange County. He founded the Medical Intelligence and Innovation Institute, MI3, and is regularly featured as a speaker of the Singularity University's Exponential Medicine, as well as a TEDx talk. He has also published numerous articles on machine learning and artificial intelligence within healthcare, and recently authored the textbook titled Intelligence-Based Medicine, Artificial Intelligence and Human Cognition in Clinical Medicine and Healthcare. Domestically here, last but not least, we have Dr. Dimitys. She is a social entrepreneur, bionics advocate, speech pathologist, researcher, and former Australian of the Year from Queensland. She is the founder and executive director of Hear and Say, one of the leading pediatric auditory, verbal, and cochlear implant centers in the world. She also has founded the Human Bionics Institute and is founder and chair of Bionics Queensland. She is an adjunct professor to the University of Queensland and adjunct associate professor to the Science and Engineering faculty, School of Mechanical, Medical, and Process Engineering at QUT and Griffith University. So I'd like to thank each of our panelists for taking time today to speak with us. In order to start our discussion, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just give a brief summary of your own personal journey into healthcare entrepreneurship and to discuss your involvement with your current organizations. So I'd like to start with Dr. Myers. Feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks again for your efforts on behalf of SOAP in Australia and spearheading the launch of the chapter. So my story in a nutshell is, as was mentioned, I followed a fairly traditional academic career, went through a fairly long tenure at the University of Colorado, and during that time, myself and some other folks invented a gadget. I'm a head and neck surgeon. I'm an ear, nose, and throat surgeon by training. And the gadget is a device that optically detects cancer in the mouth. Without going through all the gory details of the technology, to answer your question, what I discovered during that process was one that every white coat thinks they have a good idea, including me. In most instances, it's not a good idea. In terms of just creating value, I'm not saying it's not worthwhile doing basic research, but it's essentially a science project. And there's lots of value to that, obviously, but that's not what we're talking about. So in terms of commercializing something or deriving value from something, most of the time it's not a very good idea. The second part was that I had absolutely positively no clue what to do with this idea, and most of the people that I worked with didn't either. And the third problem is that most medical schools and most scientists, engineers, physicians, health professionals aren't taught how to do this during their formal training. So the thing that trips my trigger is solving that problem, because basically we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and we can talk some more about this during the conversation, but it's my view and view of others that one of the main reasons we have issues and a lack of physician entrepreneurship is a relatively dysfunctional and toxic medical education establishment that does not produce medical students that are equipped to win the fourth industrial revolution.
Well, thanks very much, and that's certainly interesting, and I'd love to touch on that a bit further. Certainly discussing healthcare professions and how they prepare not only medical students, but all allied and health professionals for the new world that you've discussed. I'll bring it over to Dr. Chang. Dr. Chang, if you'd like to just describe your personal journey and some of the organizations that you're involved with.
Well, first of all, it's nice to be back in Australia. That was my last trip about a year and a half ago. So it's nice to be back. Well, I feel like I've had several personal journeys, but in terms of entrepreneurship, probably started when I was at my first attending job at Boston Children's and Harvard Medical School, and felt like I really didn't know the business aspects of medicine. And when I left Boston Children's, decided to enter a business school, since I was going into more of a private practice situation, and sort of learned something on Saturday and Sundays and brought it back to the office on Monday. And it was a really fast learning curve to learn about the business of medicine and also getting into other aspects in medicine. So that's my entrepreneurship journey. And then since then, I've always been interested in statistics and math, and realized about 11 years ago now that data science and artificial intelligence had taken a very different turn, and went back to school and got some education on artificial intelligence, and working on that as a sort of a more recent dimension in my career. And I'm a practicing pediatric cardiologist otherwise.
Excellent. Thank you for the overview. Well, last but not least, Dr. Dimitys Dornan, we would love to hear about your experience. I know that your personal journey into your foundation and the Hear and Say organization was a bit distinct from our two guests so far. So feel free to let us know about your experiences.
Thank you very much, Mark. I am definitely a bit left of centre from where I come from as a speech pathologist. I started my speech pathology career many years ago, but on the way I came to absolutely love working with children with hearing loss. And I was sitting in Australia at just the right time when the cochlear implant or bionic ear was first being done in children. So that was 1987, having been discovered or invented in its multi-channel form back in the 70s. Now, it's an interesting time for me because I was able to see firsthand the opportunities, because I'd spent the first part of my career working in adult head injuries and strokes. And so I knew from that work that the brain was the true organ of hearing, not the ears. And I spent a number of years trying to teach children in a signing capacity. And I found that with the bionic ear coming, it really did open the doorways to the children's brains to be able to learn to listen and speak in a fairly traditional way with a parent as a natural teacher of the child. I started a not-for-profit in 1992 and with 6 children. And as the cochlear implant or bionic ear developed, I soon found out that if you did it all correctly, with lots of brain training for the children who were the recipients, by teaching their parents to do the brain training, you then got this legendary outcome, which I believe has changed the vision of what deaf children can become. I found that when I started here in Say, really by accident, I started a patient-centered, parent-delivered model with use of technology that brought it into synchronicity with normal development, knowing how much the brain can change. Now, I was also very lucky in another of my influences, and that is that every time I went to sit on a board in Washington, DC, with the A.G. Bell, Alexander Graham Bell Association, working in his old home, the Volta Bureau, I used to stay with a friend who was hearing impaired in the United States, in Washington, and he turned out to be Dr. Vinton Cerf, who's one of the co-founders of the internet. He and his friend Robert Kahn wrote the TCP/IP protocols that underpin the internet. So I had this very deep influence over many years of technology, and I think that's where my brain is centered.
Well, thanks very much. And certainly each of the three of you has obviously substantial experience and have enjoyed a unique journey throughout the innovation sector within healthcare. There's a couple of areas there. Would love to hear Dr. Myers at some point in the discussion if you've ever actually encountered bionic ears in your practice. And also, I do know that that you've also written a book on Alexander Graham Bell. Would be happy to hear more about that. But before we get there, my first question for the panel, and again, I'll go back to Dr. Myers to start. So innovation within healthcare is in fact unique compared with other industries. There are unique challenges, and of course, we must always keep the patient in mind. How would each of you describe those challenges and specifically the pitfalls that exist for entrepreneurs who are looking to create either a product or a service that will be used within healthcare? Dr. Myers?
Yeah, this is a fairly long conversation, so I'll try to keep it brief. I think that as I indicated before, it's my view that a very small percentage of physicians, and when I say physician for the purpose of this conversation, I mean any healthcare provider, dentists, pharmacists, nurses, occupational therapists, whichever. It's my view and experience that very few physicians or health professionals have an entrepreneurial mindset. And the reason for that, simply put, is that's not how you're chosen to when you're accepted to medical school, as an example, or to graduate school, or to whichever professional school it happens to be. And the problem that I see is, and I think our challenge from developing a global network, which incidentally is a nonprofit, as we mentioned, is identifying self-selected physician or health professional entrepreneurs who have a mindset that is different than a clinical mindset. So I tell people that if you decide to pursue this road of entrepreneurship, it's more important to change your mindset than it is to change your mind. And because it's just the way doctors are chosen. And it's true pretty much around the world. You know, you take a test, you're basically scored on grades, depending on where you are in the country. You take a standardized test to get in, you have a fairly routine interview, you memorize a bunch of stuff. It's really a very narrow scope of intelligence when you think about it. It is not creative. It is not imaginative. In fact, once you get in, and as physicians, you'll probably recognize this, it's a culture of conformity. It is not a culture of creativity. So there's no, what would you expect otherwise? So in my view, having spent a fair amount of time with grad students, bioengineers, health professionals, et cetera, I think about 1% of the population of physicians throughout the world have an entrepreneurial mindset. And to me, that is the single biggest barrier to scaling entrepreneurship globally. That's why I said in the very beginning, if we don't change the pipeline, it's that old Einstein saying, why would you expect something different? So that's just, we could get into a lot of structural barriers and, you know, the FDA and all the regulatory stuff and all the steps you have to go through in the roadmap. But I think at a higher level, if we're going to scale this thing, we need to change how we approach education and training upstream.
Thank you for that. And certainly agree that there are some structural barriers and even an ingrained culture that is part of the transformation that is taking place. Over to Dr. Chang. With respect to organizations or startup organizations that are looking to maybe enter into the clinical world and are creative and are looking to find solutions for their solutions to find a home within clinical practice, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think no matter where you are in the world, Australia, US, I think we know the health system is high in risk and complexity, accountability, and it's a large volume business. So it's very, very difficult to maneuver in that ecosystem. And at the same time, it's big, so it's difficult for it to make changes. And I think if you're in a business in healthcare, I think one of the things that we clinicians have to appreciate is that we were trained and educated to avoid risk and achieve excellence. And the business world, you want early lack of success. And I don't like the word failure because it's not really failure, just opportunities to make pivots. And we're not used to making pivots. We're very used to having a straight line to success and getting the patient to go home alive. And we don't have the mindset to be able to pivot around difficulties or around things that didn't have our expectations met. So I think it's very, very difficult to change your mindset when you've been educated and trained as a clinician. And Arlen is a surgeon, I'm a cardiologist. We're very high in our egos to succeed. And we take every loss, every mistake very, very personally. And in business, you have to have the opposite mindset. You can't take any of this personally. You could have the best idea and the best group of people and still not succeed. And you can't take that personally, but we don't have the mindset after our education and training to be able to pivot as nimbly as I think some startups and entrepreneurs can. So we have to learn to do that better.
And I would add, if I may interrupt, to that point, that I have a saying that in the entrepreneurial world, in addition to mindset, I think the second most important thing is motivation, intrinsic motivation. And I have this saying that if you're going to get into entrepreneurship, you must make it personal, but you can't take it personally. If you just listen to our stories, there is a personal story, whether it's a relative, whether it's a child, whether it's an experience, whether it's something you encountered that really aggravates you or really inspires you to fix it. And I would argue that if you don't have that little voice in your head motivating you because of that personal experience, you're not going to succeed. But as Anthony says, you can't take it personally. Because unlike medicine, maybe not so unlike medicine in some circumstances, you will fail repeatedly at a very high percentage. Now, fortunately in medicine, we don't do that because we pay a price for it and we're trained, as he said, to not fail. But of course we do. We have complications, we have deaths. But the point is, you can't take it personally. You have to get up, you have to brush yourself off, and you have to keep going. And that little voice in your head has to keep reminding you that you're doing this for a reason.
Well, Dr. Dornan, you are somebody that did take those steps to actually address a specific problem, and I'm sure that you had challenges along the way. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I had lots of challenges along the way, and most of them were to do with funding and finance, but I guess even bigger than that were the psychological ones, where the professionals in my area at the time did not believe that deaf children could learn to listen and speak, or could use the new technology, or that it would work. And that was probably my greatest challenge, as apart from the funding problem. And I found that I had to learn a lot, and I was very lucky in that about 10 years ago, I was nominated twice for the position of the Social Entrepreneur of the Year run by Ernst & Young for Australia. And I said no the first time. I'm not an entrepreneur. The second time, I did some study on what a social entrepreneur was, and I said yes, I would be an entrant in the social entrepreneur section. And I was awarded that, and that led me to a whole world of the most amazing people, experts in every field who've taught me so much. One of the best things that I've ever done is you're entitled to go to the global Ernst & Young business leader, business entrepreneurs of the year masterclasses in Monaco. And I've only been able to afford to go once, but I learned so much in that once. It was the best money ever spent. And a whole week in Monaco was not to be sneezed at.
No, I think that there's a lot of young innovators out there that are looking to hopefully also spend a weekend in Monaco after their startups are successful. In terms of, we've talked a bit about some of the challenges, but with those challenges are certainly a great deal of opportunities. So this question, I'll have Dr. Chang start. What trends are you seeing both in health and wellness delivery, the delivery of healthcare services, both inside and outside of the hospital, as well as newly emerging technologies? Obviously, you're somebody that works very heavily with AI and machine learning applications. What opportunities do you see for some of the either medical students or young founders that are looking to take advantage of the opportunities in healthcare?
Again, from my trip to Australia about a year and a half ago, I learned a lot visiting several centers actually while I was there. We had a AMN meeting there with an excellent faculty. And one of the things I learned about Australia is you rely on long distance delivery of medicine even more than we do. So I think with the situation at hand now, with the pandemic, I think it's been exponential in terms of volume and expectations and delivery of any sort of virtual health, and beyond just a Zoom conference with a patient family, but the decentralization of healthcare delivery, especially for complex and long-term disease management, I think is going to have a major boost in terms of capability of devices and wearable technology, and even technology at the level of having a primitive AI tool even directly embedded into the wearable devices that's already being researched and being tested right now. So I think in this decade, we're going to see a pretty high level proliferation of devices that can give us indications of health and well-being of our population, and especially the aging population. So everything from ambient intelligence with your home having cameras and voice detectors to wearable technology for your heart rate and heart rhythm and oxygen level. I think that's going to be very, very commonplace and as normal and routine as vital signs in the clinic. And all of that will have to be interpreted with good machine and deep learning methodologies to really facilitate the delivery of care on the clinician side. Because right now, if you just do that, the clinicians will be overwhelmed with data that they don't know what to do with. So you have to actually have intelligent data in the feedback loop format to really deliver virtual care. So I see virtual care with the entire portfolio of tools and capabilities to be a big development this decade.
And Dr. Dornan, if I'm not mistaken, the Hear and Say organization does employ some type of virtual care?
We certainly do. We've done that since the year 2000 because you're right, Dr. Chang. We are very big. The state of Queensland is 3 times bigger than the size of Texas, and we do have a lot of distances to cover, because most of the people live along the outside, along the coastline, and a lot less in the central areas. So it can take 24 hours to drive by car from Brisbane to the top of Queensland, and that's a long way for a patient to drive for your care. So we've been pioneering in every area of telepractice or virtual care. I think what I'm looking at now, because of the changing financial background, is to look at virtual first care, which I hope will lead us into a whole new area of virtual care, which will allow us to continue to be financially viable. And I would love to know what you think about that.
Dr. Chang, do you have any thoughts to that?
No, I think we really look to countries like yours actually to see how fast and how good we can deliver virtual care, and obviously it has its limitations. And the US is particularly unfamiliar with this level of virtual care, but during the pandemic, I've been seeing patients now virtually for a year, and I asked my colleagues, and none of them is going to go back to 100% on-site clinic visits. I think I'm going to settle to about 30 to 40% virtual care, which is much higher than anyone had predicted a year and a half ago that will occur. So I think that's the next wave of the healthcare delivery. And I think you're going to see hospitals becoming really the home for basically procedures. And virtually everything, excuse the pun there, but virtually everything will be delivered outside the hospital. And I think that's a good thing. We should think about the hospital as the epicenter of a health system for a region, rather than being a location where all the care is being delivered.
Certainly, one of the aspects here in Queensland that the Queensland AI Hub is actually focusing on is to assist with expanding the reach of capabilities, and virtual care certainly plays a role in that. Also, not sure if any of you have any thoughts on the role of industry partnerships. Here in Australia, there are some telecommunications providers that are also actively pitching in to contribute to expanding the reach and capabilities of the telecom landscape. Just an open question. Does anyone have any thoughts on the role of industry linking up with healthcare service providers, but also innovative companies that are coming up?
After you, Alan.
Go ahead. I'll speak after you.
Thank you. I'll just make sure I've got my microphone on. At the moment, I'm also doing a role as chair of the Industry and Innovation Forum for a major group in Australia. If you divide all of the scientists in Australia into 4 academies, I belong to the Australian Association for Technology, Science and Engineering. And I'm currently chair of the Industry and Innovation Forum for that. And part of my role and the role of my forum is to engage better with industry. So I'm extremely interested in hearing what you people have to say, but I'm very strongly attached to the idea that collaborating with industry is going to be the way to all of our future to get out of our current financial crises. I'd love to hear what people think.
So there was a recent McKinsey article that sort of dealt with trends, and for entrepreneurs that are sort of looking for where to find a problem to solve, they alluded to 4 basic sort of big picture trends. One is global aging. The population of the world is aging, and the number, and particularly in developed countries, the birth rates are dropping. Such places as Japan, South Korea, United States, Italy. And when you play out the math, when the birth rate drops below 2.1 and the aging population scales, in not too long a period of time, you no longer have a country, because the death outweighs the birth and the population drops, and you have all sorts of economic issues, social upheaval, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and just in my area, aging at home, and when I say area, I mean Colorado, but other places, aging at home is a big deal. Smart cities, transportation, social determinants, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big opportunity, global aging. Two, we don't have to tell this audience, advancing technology and the pace of change and the turnover in technology. You know, we're talking about virtual care and telemedicine. The first telemedicine demonstration or patent was in 1924. It's taken us 100 years to get to where we are now. Now, when you look at the pace of adoption of, say, the iPhone, I mean, how long did it take people to get a radio versus how long did it take people to get an iPhone at scale? It's much, much shorter. So these technologies, and Anthony can speak volumes about AI technologies that weren't even envisioned 10 years ago, and now are rapidly disseminated. Typical examples are reading chest x-rays with artificial intelligence supplementation. The third is globalization. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a doctor who was doing some graduate study in the United States. He's gone back to Libya. He wants to start a soap chapter in Libya. And 5 of the 10 largest economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at the urbanization of society, that's another opportunity to deal with all of these issues. And the pace is just much, much faster. Companies don't last as long. The companies in Standard & Poor's or the Dow will turn over much more quickly, et cetera, et cetera. So, and incidentally, that represents a problem for physician entrepreneurs. Today, somebody sent me something describing 260 virtual care companies in the United States. And we're talking about a year of COVID. There were virtually, pardon the pun, none before COVID, and these things just exploded. So how do you break through the noise if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to do virtual care? And finally, this morning, I had breakfast with a friend of mine who's starting a company, and he's doing virtual dialysis in rural hospitals of Colorado. Why? For the same reasons you are in Australia, because it's estimated in the United States about 35% of rural hospitals, typically 25 or 30 beds or at that size, will go out of business. And the hospital is sort of the touchstone of the community in these places. So you're not just talking about fixing a hospital, you're talking about resuscitating a community in these very rural areas, in mountains in our case, you know, in the outback in Central Australia and yours. So, and he is monitoring, and the model is these hospitals don't have access to dialysis equipment. He provides it. And guess who takes care of the patient? A doctor in Phoenix, who is a nephrologist, who is remotely monitoring the dialysis with the help of a nurse on site should something go wrong or they have to touch a dial or fix something. So all of these examples are pretty typical of what I'm seeing in terms of international physician entrepreneurship. It's an enormous opportunity. And to your point about industry, so 2 days ago, I interviewed a guy Bill Carpoo, who is the executive, he's the president and CEO of an outfit called Octane. And Anthony can talk about what he's doing in Octane in terms of creating an AI cluster. You can't do this without industry. But you just have to figure out how to do it. And we can get into a long conversation about clusters and ecosystems and innovation districts and various funding models and all that other business. But the fact of the matter is, you can't scale this without, it's a team sport. You can't do it without collaboration. It's a public, private, academic, government collaboration, and each one plays a role.
Dr. Chang, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I did. I didn't realize I only talked to Bill, but I'm not surprised. What he's referring to is a very ambitious project. It's actually so big we shouldn't call it a project. It's a program that I was asked to talk to our regional CEOs about AI over dinner. And they had asked me, this is about a year and a half ago, so it was before COVID, right before COVID lockdown for us, what would be a really good sector to go into? I said, it might be a little self-serving, but how about healthcare, but health rather than medicine? And, I hadn't heard from them in a year. And unbeknownst to me, a lot of discussions ensued after that dinner. And people came back to me through Bill and said, we like that idea. We'd like to move forward. Can you be one of our sort of leads on this ambitious goal of achieving the best health for the population, but leveraging AI and emerging technologies to do that? I think that's basically, if you figure out the mass here of precision medicine on one axis, population health on the other, that's a lot of area you can cover with AI. And I think only with AI and similar technologies can you do that. You're not going to be able to rely on traditional medicine models to be able to do both of those very well for the long term. It's just too much data, too much information and knowledge to cover. So I think while the vision is very ambitious to be the healthiest population we figure in the country first, but maybe we could be a model for future similar minded regions around the world. Perhaps Australia can join us, and just be able to really use and leverage technology for delivering precision medicine for anyone and population for everyone. So that's sort of like our mantra. And as Arlen was referring to, so you can't do that without everyone at the table. So again, quietly, and I was totally unaware, they had talked to close to 100 companies, and everyone is on board, at least philosophically, that we should do this for basically our next generation here in Orange County, California. And all the companies are on board. A lot of CEOs are on board. So I never imagined that using AI for health would resonate this quickly and this well with people, but apparently, I think this pandemic has taught us one thing. We need a portal to a new way of doing things, and that will bring us hope. And I think they see this as the most direct and logical way to bring us hope for health and for our next generation.
Thank you for that. And one of the things that you've highlighted is the importance of strategic partnerships and even coalition building, particularly for small organizations that have yet to scale, that maybe don't have the resources to have multiple functions. It's at times easier for them to form a strategic partnership and have synergy. Last question at the moment is for Dr. Dornan. So you're obviously somebody who has successfully pursued an innovation pathway. You've successfully established a company that's been running for almost 30 years. What advice would you give to young companies who are looking to successfully grow their business and make an impact in healthcare?
Use technology and build relationships. And I have to say that I've sort of, at the moment, have started another group called Bionics Queensland. I started nationally first. called the Human Bionics Interface Alliance. But I pulled back to Queensland, so I had a smaller sea of people that I could help to inspire and get them to work with me. But as of this week, we're going back national again, and after that, global. So Bionics Queensland will become some global bionics brand, building off the fact that the bionic ear is the first successfully commercialized neuromodulation device, and from there it went out. I see Mark has no signal.
Yeah, I'm still here, just changing the batteries.
Oh, I'm so glad. I thought it was me, Mark. I really thought it was me, and I was starting to freak out.
It's a good point that no matter how advanced our technology gets, it's always limited by
plan B.
small things.
Yes.
So you're discussing obviously Bionics Queensland. Any practical advice? There's obviously some, again, innovators and founders that are working in this space. Anything specific either within the bionic space or just across the role of innovation?
Just build those relationships. Find the people who are synergistic to your cause, and form the relationships in any way that's possible. Physical proximity does help, but virtual is fantastic. And one of the features, of course, at the current moment is the fact that we've got such great connectivity, and I can talk to people like Arlen and Anthony and yourself, Mark, for at the same time, which is absolutely brilliant. That connectivity is one of the trends, I believe, in medicine at the moment that we're starting to see. Certainly I see it in hearing, but in all of the other areas, people are starting to look at different ways that they can connect, not only with each other personally, but with each other's computers and with each other's digital environment. And I think it's going to be a really exciting time. And I do agree that artificial intelligence has a huge part to play.
Feel free. Go ahead, Dr. Morrison.
So my take on this is, and this is directed toward physician entrepreneurs. And so my take is, what got you here won't get you there. In other words, all the initials after your name, all the stuff, first in the class, your entire life, all that business, it's really not, it's a different mindset. So the first thing you have to do is you sort of have to come down off the mountain and figure out what you don't know. Because the large majority of physicians simply don't know what they don't know, as I alluded to previously. So that means that you have to have the humility to do that. Doctors are not known for, particularly surgeons are not known for that. So it's a challenge. And you have to, and so in my view, to echo a little bit what Dimitys said, you need education. I'm talking about the business side, the entrepreneurship innovation side. You need education, resources, networks, mentors, experience, peer-to-peer support, and non-clinical career guidance. And most people are not good at that. And just as an example, most health professionals are not networked. They simply are not. I call it being linked out. And if they have connections, they are very narrow and typically in their own domain of expertise. ENT surgeons hanging out with ENT surgeons. But that's not where the innovation is. The innovation, as Dimitys referred to with the Ernst & Young thing, comes from telecom. It comes from aerospace. It comes from geophysics. It comes from big data and tech. It's not where the innovation is in medicine. So unless, and we could go chapter and verse, GPS, telemedicine, came from NASA. So if you want to go down this road, you really have to expand your networks. Fortunately, as was referred to, you can do that virtually. Hopefully, we're going to get back to face-to-face, which is even better. But you really have to sort of rethink how you're going to program yourself to do this. And it's a learning curve. Anybody can do this. It's a myth that entrepreneurs are born, that kind of thing. Anybody can do this, but the main thing is you have to change your mindset. And if you can't do that, then do yourself and everybody else a favor and don't do it.
Well, I think, so first of all, I'd like to encourage our audience to submit any questions that you'd like any of our panelists to address during the call. Dr. Chang, do you have any thoughts on anything that's been discussed with respect to, again, young companies that are looking to successfully grow, particularly in the AI space or machine learning space?
Yeah, I think networking is the obvious one and build relationships. But I think to balance that, you need to have somehow develop a supreme self-confidence as if you couldn't fail, and be bold. Even though you know the odds are not in your favor, be bold. And then one of the best advices one of my mentors gave me was, go through your projects and your ideas like you couldn't fail. If you just took that self-imposed limitation or constraint away from you, you'd be surprised how much you will succeed. And I've always been surprised with some bold ideas I've had, how they've succeeded. But they all involved being generous with your time and being professional in your demeanor and be relatable, and so that people have a certain way of liking you enough to keep being involved in your projects and your activities. I think that's very, very key. And everyone's busy. So if they say, well, I don't have the bandwidth to do this with you, that means it wasn't high enough on their priority list. And somehow you have to be able to nudge them into doing things with you, especially people that you think are very, very talented. So I've been over backwards for those people. Arlen's one of them. That they genuinely have to like you and feel like you're on a big mission to do some good in the world. And that's a tall order for any clinician.
And Anthony is being shy. He has a tremendous portfolio of stuff. If you're interested in AI, if you're interested in, you don't know anything about it, but you're interested in learning about it because you're hearing all the buzz and, gee, maybe I ought to get into this. There is absolutely no excuse for not learning this. It's free. It's accessible. There's a gazillion people in the world that are sharing ideas and want to talk about it. There's just absolutely no excuse. And I would tell you, the education, while important, is the least important in the entrepreneurial journey. So do you have to have it? Yes, but it's the price of entry. All the other stuff we talked about are the success factors, including luck. Peter Drucker wrote, 7 sources of innovation, probably, 50, 60 years ago. And one of them are unexpected failures and unexpected successes. Who knew? I mean, you had an idea and the timing wasn't right. The moons weren't in phase. You didn't know the right people. The funding wasn't available, but you stuck with the idea. And guess what? 20 years later, it took you 20 years to be famous overnight. You just have to stick with it and wait for them. Now, do you have to pivot, change? Yeah, sure. But that's what you learn from the unexpected failure.
You work hard at, I think Australians can relate to this. I used to sell more than I do now, but you just have your sail up and sometimes the wind will come and take you to amazing places. But you have to work hard to get your sail up and ready. And most people don't have their sail up and ready when the wind comes, so.
Dr. Dornan, do you have any thoughts on just the role of luck along the way?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, please?
Do you have any thoughts on the role of luck versus being just diligent?
Definitely, I have some thoughts on luck. I was myself lucky to be in a very small school and a very small class. I was lucky enough to have the very best of education. I was very, very lucky to be able to learn from the best in entrepreneurialism. And I was very lucky with my the timing of when I came into my industry was at the same time as Professor Graham Clark was developing or inventing the multi-channel cochlear ear. And it was the same time that Dr. Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn were inventing the internet. as the first connection of the computers in the Pentagon. And I just think that, and the fact that Dr. Cerf these days, his wife uses cochlear implants and he himself uses hearing aids. It's no secret, it's all over the press. And I think the fact that we met up together and he talked me into how well technology could enhance what we could do. I said to him once, what is the next best thing? And he said, it's the Internet of Things. Well, now that was years and years ago. And now here I am using, being lucky enough to be in a state that is developing the cochlear implant that for the first time links with interconnectivity, the left ear to the right ear, to the net, to the cloud, to the Internet of Things, to an app on an iPhone. And I think this is what we're going to see as we move forward in medicine. We're going to have this amazing confluence of influences because of all of these influences from the internet and connectivity.
Well, one of the underlying currents and currencies of all of the innovation is, of course, data. And as we're approaching the top of the hour, we do have a couple of audience questions. The first does pertain to data. So to build robust and fair AI, we of course need to access large clinical data sets for algorithm trainings. But clinical data is currently siloed and data access for R&D purposes is limited. So the three of you as clinicians are in sort of a unique position where you have access to clinical data. But there are a lot of innovators that are on the outside of the clinical world that are looking to leverage the relationships that we've talked about. So how can we solve the problem of limited data sharing in healthcare? And I'd like Dr. Chang, if you'd like to take that question.
Well, there's not going to be an easy solution, and this is perhaps the biggest obstacle I see for moving forward with a lot of the AI tools that are available. But I think it takes, I half jokingly say it takes humans to do artificial intelligence, meaning it's the relationships you build with leaders of other health systems that perhaps will be willing to share data with you. And so that's one thing, is you have to get the human champions on board. As a matter of fact, I am forming a group of centers that are doing AI medicine in the health system. I'm proud to say that Australia has 1 or 2 centers that will be represented in this sort of federation of centers. I think we will be probably putting forth a white paper about how and why everyone must share their data. Now, even if we did that, it's not going to be on everyone's agenda. So you're going to need different innovative ways of sharing data. And one of the ways I'm looking into is using federated learning from other sectors in society. Again, this comes back to what Arlen was saying earlier. To be innovative in your area, all you have to do is look into other sectors and how they're doing things and bring it back to your sector. So federated learning is essentially using a local data model to work on your local data, and then you ship the parameters of the model to a central repository rather than the data. So the data stays put, the model goes to a central repository, so you don't run the risk of a breach in your privacy. So that's something that would be potentially a very likely solution, or one of the solutions that would be available. So, I mean, humans are very smart. We'll get around this obstacle without having everyone to share data every single time. It might be a different strategy for a given disease or a given population in terms of commingling data, and you can do it a number of ways. So I think in this decade, we'll be able to figure that out.
Mark, did you want to address the education question, the medical student question?
Sure. I was going to get to that in just a moment here. So we do have another question that has come in. So obviously we have some medical students and other healthcare professionals that are listening today. What advice do each of you have for current medical students or any healthcare professional that's interested in pursuing some form of entrepreneurship, either later in their career or even earlier? And Dr. Mars, you can go ahead and start.
Okay. So Anthony and I and others are involved in this initiative that is medical school education, and particularly various aspects of medical education. So there's a lot we can refer you to in terms of resources, but the headline from my perspective is we all know that those of us who have been through medical training know that being a medical student is a full-time gig. I mean, it's just all consuming. And you're primarily occupying yourself with learning the material and passing the tests and getting credentials and getting a residency and all the other stuff that really is top of mind. But when it comes to, well, gee, maybe I'm interested in this stuff, what would I do? So my advice is, and again, these are just headlines. Number one, as I mentioned, you're going to need I'm talking about the business of medicine, innovation, entrepreneurship. You're going to need education, resources, networks, mentors, peer support, and non-clinical experience and non-clinical career guidance. Now, because you are consumed with being a medical student and you don't have a lot of time, and because most medical students do not leave room in the curriculum to study this stuff, you're going to have to do it on your own. And that means start your educational pathway. And as we indicated before, there are innumerable free resources. So avail yourself, start learning the terms, I mean, I'm doing it. You know, I don't know anything about data except I ran into Anthony and he's teaching me a little bit about this stuff. But so I go to these conferences and meetings and you learn. But the second is expand your networks. We've already mentioned that. That is critically important, both internal and external. Find a mentor, and there are various ways of doing that, including contacting the people on this panel, like me or Anthony or anybody. We're all very willing to share whatever we've learned in our mistakes. And it's up to you whether you want to listen to it or not, but we'll talk to the cows come home if you're willing to listen. So build your networks, find a mentor, get involved in your regional ecosystem, like Queensland. If you're interested in AI, get involved in the ecosystem. Go to their meetings, meet the people, go on their chats, read the stuff they're producing, connect to the industry piece of the ecosystem and figure out whether there's something that you can do. And you also need non-clinical career guidance because, again, you just don't know what you don't know. And the only way you're going to know that is to talk to people who've been there, done that, and made the mistakes and are willing to share. It's just like clinical medicine. The attending, you know, we call it's clinical judgment. I call it clinical business judgment. In medicine, judgment comes from experience, and experience is another word for mistakes. So we're essentially entrepreneurial attendings. And those of us that like doing this stuff, we're more than willing to help you and give you advice to do this. The final point is, I often hear medical students say, and what's happening in the United States, I'm not sure it's happening in Australia, particularly in places like Stanford, where you're in Silicon Valley, everything is tech, and medical students say, you know what, I'm not going to do a residency. I'm going to get a degree and I'm going to go to work for a startup. Now, personally, I think that's a bad idea, but some people do it. And by the way, you know, we're advocating for a second pathway, like it or not. That's what a lot of folks want to do. So it's, you know, it's customer wants something, figure out a way to give it to them. And I think it's a big benefit actually to do that. We have to restructure the curriculum to do that. But again, we're working on things like that. So you're not going to be able to get a whole lot of entrepreneurial experience during the standard 4-year medical curriculum. Some places, different story. Anthony and I can share some places that have been pretty innovative, that are changing their curriculum. There's a medical school in Illinois that only accepts data scientists and engineers into medical school. And the result was they came out with a saliva COVID test that is now being deployed throughout the entire state of Illinois. So there are examples of how this is changing, but by and large, most places, particularly around the world, it's a different story. So that's just my advice. So Anthony, maybe you want to chime in and give your 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm realistically very optimistic, but as we said at the very beginning, we need to change everything way up the chain, starting from probably even before medical school, that the students going in. So the good news is, despite the pandemic and the risks that are involved in our profession now at a higher level than ever before, at least in the US, I don't know about the situation in Australia, but more students are applying to medical schools than ever before, which astounds me given that this is now a higher risk profession than before. And also, most doctors are not recommending medicine as a career for their family members or their friends. So despite that, more young people are going to medicine than ever before. I look at the project that Arlen and I are doing for redesigning a medical school curriculum, for me personally, as a real privilege to leave an amazing platform for the next generation that really needs to be done. If this many young people are going to medicine, we are obligated to give them an amazing platform to learn from, including entrepreneurship, innovation, AI, the whole works. And Arlen came up with 10 learning modules that they have to have, and at least some exposure to. So they're not going into the world totally unarmed to fight the battles. And I think some of them really surprise me. The young people always surprise me when you give them a small amount of sort of mentorship. First of all, I call it a circular mentorship because I learn just as much from them as they learn from me, because I stay young intellectually from the questions they ask me. And at the end of every summer of our internship program for about 100 students, I am just blown away by the ideas that now some of them are just totally without fear, which is what I try to preach. Natural language processing tools into dolls for children. I mean, the imagination runs wild, but there's a reason why it's easier to teach a 7-year-old to ski than to teach a 35-year-old to ski. It's because they have no fear. They have not been beaten back by their adult years to really be afraid to imagine. And I think being able to imagine what you want to do in life is such a gift. And I was blessed with that. I fulfilled just about everything I imagined I could do. And I think that we should give every young person an opportunity. And if they want, and that's why I think Arlen and I agree that, and Stanford is particularly a place where you lose, I think, 10 or 15% of their medical school class every year, because they're sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley, and these companies just come in and give them amazing offers. And sometimes they even drop out of medical school. And I just think that's a shame, because I think there's such a better asset later on as a clinician to these companies than having done 2 years of medical school and coming out. And I think one of the things I'm always really suggesting to your younger clinicians is, you want to be in the AI space, the first thing should definitely not be picking up a programming book and learning how to program, because that's going to take so much time away from you to get to be a better doctor. What you really should do, in my humble opinion, is be a better doctor, or a doctor with more experience, because that's what's needed in AI and healthcare. Not more people that can program, but that's the natural inclination and affinity, is to go program. It's imagine I gave this talk just last week at Stanford, and perhaps we can forward you the link. It's about my musings after 10 or 15 years in AI and healthcare. And one of them is, we're pretend the clinicians and even medical students are string players in the orchestra. And now Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is demanding new sections of the orchestra with brass and woodwinds and a choir even, right? It doesn't mean you leave your orchestra seat and go to learn to play the trumpet. You're not needed to play the trumpet. What you should do is accommodate the new musicians and the new singers in the orchestra and play that amazing symphony. But it's very, very tempting just to say, I want to go learn to program because I want to get involved in AI. That I agree with Arlen there. That's not what you should be doing. What you should be doing is learn how to adapt to the AI world and bring it back to medicine, be accountable for in terms of learning how to read a paper, learning how to assess a project. And in your spare time, if you're interested, I think it is useful to learn how to program. And I had to do that in school. But it's a few thousand hours you're going to have to expend to get to the level that you can actually independently do a project. I personally don't think it's worth a few thousand hours for some of the people, if not most of the people.
Well, just so we spent quite a bit of time talking about medical students who are interested in innovation. Dr. Dornan, do you have any thoughts on maybe some speech pathologists or audiologists that are also interested in trying to pursue these types of pathways?
I think that if all kinds of professionals were more tuned in to the applications for technology within their own business, and then I think someone said before, maybe it was you, Alan, to look at professionals who are working in adjacent fields or in fields around you and see how you can apply these things to what you're doing. For example, I've been looking at people who are using brain-computer interface and looking at different ways that people who have no form of communication can use those techniques to be in touch with their environment and with other people and with a computer. And I think if everybody, sorry, I'll just answer that. If everybody could keep those adjacent fields open, I have learned so much from doing that. And right now we're doing our first studies at Hear and Say, which is the centre that I started. We're doing our first studies on training our professionals how to teach subjects who are very communication challenged to use some of these devices. So it's really exciting. I love it.
Excellent. Well, our last question of the day, we did talk a bit about accessibility of healthcare services, expanding the reach of accessibility. We haven't talked at all about health equity and particularly increasing access of health services to those who currently have less access. The question from our audience is, do you think AI will increase or decrease accessibility of healthcare to the wider population, and specifically to those who have less access? And if so, how so? So maybe Dr. Myers, I don't know if you'd like to start with that.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and it applies to, there's the argument that AI, as an example, could actually make inequity worse. There's the whole issue of the digital divide. I mean, we're talking digital health, virtual health. Okay, if you have no digital, you don't have digital health. And in the United States, a significant percentage of people, I don't know what it is in Australia, but do not have access to broadband. And broadband is just one aspect. It's sort of a three-legged stool, because if you don't have a computer, having 5G doesn't do you any good. And if your computer goes on the fritz and you don't know what to do, not having tech support doesn't help, because you're staring at a blank screen. So you have to have hardware, you have to have internet and broadband, and you have to have tech support and education. And putting all those things together, and this gets to the issue of industry collaboration. And I could tell you a lot of stories in Colorado, because it's a fairly rural state on the western part, but it's urban up and down a main highway. About 25% of Colorado citizens do not have broadband. And I don't need to tell you the impact of that during COVID. Work, education, healthcare, you name it. I mean, it's like clean water. Now, our president, you'll notice, is trying to include that as part of a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan. It remains to be seen whether that's going to happen. But so yes, it will exacerbate inequities if these folks can't get access to it. It will make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And unfortunately, that's a fairly common stream in American society and other places around the world. So that's an important issue, let alone all of the bias issues that come into AI, all of the There's a recent book that was written by Daniel Kahneman that just came out called Noise, which is really a variability in predictability. And Anthony, again, can go chapter and verse and all the data, the difference between bias and noise and all that other business. But yes, it runs the risk of making things worse. Two other aspects that I think are part of that are AI law and AI ethics. And again, we could have a long conversation about all three. But until or unless we address those issues, we run the risk of just making things worse.
Can I just add to that, Mark? I think one of the best dividends, and maybe it's underestimated, about AI in healthcare is we're going to be forced to really self-examine our practices and our biases. And hopefully this will lead to eventual reconciliation with that. And I think, and a lot of the biases are unintentional. When we look at research projects, we have going in with unintentional bias. And then we realize that, yes, we were biased. So I think, yes, I think initially we'll probably go through a phase. It's almost inevitable that we're going to exaggerate the inequity. But what I'm hoping is we'll swing back and making sure that things will be equitable for the long term. I think for the short term, it'll be hard to avoid that initial period where the differences might be exaggerated. And we have to remember that people talk about data going in as the part that people worry about, but it's the entire project pipeline that's at risk for bias. It's not just the data going into the models. The model themselves may have already embedded in them previous biases, so essentially automating bias. And then when the output comes out from the models, we also have to remember that how the output results are being used is also subject to bias depending on who the users are. So basically the entire project pipeline is at risk for bias, and we just have to be really, really good about scrutinizing it so that we don't have bias. And perhaps, as Alan Turing said, why are we putting humans into the role of dealing with machines? We need to come up with machines to deal with machines, and I totally agree with that. I think some of this bias check may have to be automated by algorithms to kind of look at other algorithms to make sure that, in fact, there is no bias, and people are already starting to work on that, using machine learning to check data going in and check the workflow through the data science project to make sure that it is as free of bias as possible. But I think relying on humans to do all this is going to be very, very difficult.
There's a topic close to Australians, and you know this better than most, that the highest rate of melanoma in the world is in Australia. And the data indicates that a third of dermatologists misdiagnose clinically a melanoma. So yesterday, today, Google or somebody came out with this big, essentially it's a direct-to-consumer algorithm to take a picture of your mole on your iPhone, and then you upload it to the engine, and it tells you using pattern recognition techniques that whether it's a melanoma or not with AI. Now, that introduces all kinds of issues. And let's just speak specifically to the equity issue. So I'm just interested, because you guys live there, given Aboriginal populations, given the large landscape, given digital divides and doctors flying all over the outback to go render care and now via virtual care. I mean, what is your take on this? What's your view? Is this going to make things worse, or what's happening in your part of the world?
May I answer that?
Sure.
Can I answer that? I think that it could. Definitely the potential is there. But the way I look at it is that with AI, the way it's going, I like what you said before about it takes humans to get AI going. And I've written that down here, and I'll go to sleep on that one. It sounds really great. What I think we need to think about is also that women are often the health keepers of the families. They should not be. Everybody should look after their own health, but often it's up to the women to do it. Now, what I know is that the internet has leveled the playing field for women, because all of a sudden, people at the other end of the internet don't know whether it's women or men who are on the machine, and therefore it allows more women to go into highly paid jobs and so forth. And I also wanted to just comment on something someone else said about access with computers and the broadband. I really think there's a huge future in mHealth, mobile health, and especially for those who don't have those connection facilities. And I think it's very underused. I could see the potential quite a few years ago, but I personally haven't put a lot of time into it because I know it's going to take more energy. But I really do think that that's an area that we really should be looking into seriously, and it certainly is on my list.
So by mobile health, you mean like Fitbit or Apple Watch or
not quite that
remote sensing devices?
Including those things, but even easier things like push texts and health messages that pop up, maybe to subscribers, but also put out by governments or local health clinics. Something that would keep reminding people what the right way to look after themselves is.
Yeah, and I also would mention that the cable industry and the entertainment industry is getting very active in this area. If you look at the statistics, a lot more people around the world have a television than an iPhone. So if you could provide via that old school legacy communications platform what we're talking about, it's cheaper and it's more disseminated. So you're going to see a lot of that, and you're already seeing it. You're already seeing in our world Comcast or these large media companies, communication companies, telecom, Verizon, AT&T, they all have a health wing. So they're on to your idea and they're pursuing it actively. And of course, there's satellite. If we're up to Elon, this wouldn't be an issue because everybody would have internet access via a satellite. But again, be careful what you ask for, because as we get toward more do-it-yourself medicine, it creates issues, not the least of which is, does any of this do anybody any good? It's convenient, but does it really deliver value? And maybe Anthony can allude to his experience with Apple Watch and AFib and all these other, remote sensing cardiac monitors. So Anthony, you want to share your experience?
Right now, the AI we use for Apple Watches is probably, I'm probably it for my patients. There's not enough intelligence built in to the monitors, and I often have to be the one to screen out the false positives, which is the vast majority of cases. So I'm hoping that we'll get smarter with these devices, because having more data doesn't help me as a clinician. Having data that's intelligent helps me as a clinician. So I think we do have to be careful with the tsunami of wearable devices coming our way, that we're just not inundating the overworked clinician even more with data, and then be accountable if that clinician wasn't aware of that data out there, right? So that's the other thing, is the medical legal aspects of missing something that's being monitored for the clinician. That's what I'm really concerned about, is the vast amount of data coming in, streaming in without any real interpretation. So we do have to go through a decade of, I think, having some real challenges. But I think a decade or two from now, we'll be glad that we went through this journey.
Certainly the curation of data, as we approach the call, the curation of data is an area that will probably be further developed, including the regulation of that data. We talked a bit about bias in data and having access to wide data sets that are inclusive, and maybe even having those data sets make their way into the regulations, so that AI tools can be trained on a minimum representative data set that's clinically relevant, could be a future benchmark. So we're just at about 5 minutes remaining on our call here. Just stepping back a bit for any folks that are interested in learning more about any of your respective organizations. Can you maybe point folks in the right direction of learning more? And we'll start, I guess, with Dr. Myers of Society of Physician Entrepreneurs.
Sure. So if you're interested, we're at www.sopenet.org. And as we've indicated in this conversation, there's a lot that we can offer you down in this journey. We collaborate with a lot of folks. It's an open innovation network, which means you don't need to be a health professional to join. We did that intentionally because it speaks to the point that was mentioned before, which is sick care. And that's the word I use for American healthcare, because it's really not healthcare. It's most of the money spent taking care of sick people. So it's sick care can't be fixed from inside. It has to be fixed and informed by outside industry and by outside thinking. So that's the idea behind it being an open innovation network. So if you're interested, my LinkedIn profile is fairly easy to see, and I'm happy to collaborate. So thanks for the opportunity.
Sure thing. And Dr. Chang?
Yeah, a couple of big projects I'm involved in. One of them I think we already mentioned. It's the American Board of AI Medicine. I think we're actually looking into partnering with Australia to bring it to Australia, where we educate anyone in healthcare, from healthcare executives to clinicians to medical students even, to give them a very broad overview of AI in healthcare, and it's particularly designed for healthcare. So we have a monthly review course, and you get an educational certificate if you pass an assessment. And it's been so popular that we're already developing the intermediate course for the few clinicians that are not listening to my suggestion and want to go to the next level and actually learn the program. So we're going to offer some of that hands-on programming, as well as a more sophisticated level of understanding. So that's abim.org. I put it in the chat area. And then I'm also chair of AI Med, which does a lot of AI Med meetings for clinicians. And we have our global summit in January. Quite a few Australians usually come, so I don't know what's going to happen this time in January of 2022. And we usually get about 600 or more people. So from about 25 countries. And it's a wonderful mix of people from all over the world in all different sectors, and including investors and students. And it's a really amazing gathering of people interested in this space. So that's AI Med and the Global Summit in January of 2022.
Great. Last but not least, Dr. Dornan.
You can find Hear and Say at www.hearandsay.com.au, and you can find Bionics Queensland at www.bionicsqueensland.com.au.
Perfect. Well, thank each of the three of you panelists today for joining and for taking time to speak with us, as well as for everyone who has participated in today's webinar. We're just right on time here, so thank you very much. If you have any further questions, there's some follow-up contacts and websites to learn more. Thank you very much, and have a good night.